Bill Prater is the founder and CEO of Business Mastery and the creator of Scalology. He earned his reputation as America's business alchemist by helping business owners and entrepreneurs break free of inertia and accelerate into the future they dream of. He loves nothing better than sharing what he has learned by working with those who are dissatisfied with the status quo and eager to transform themselves and their business. He created Scalology and the Business Mastery System as the core foundational principles of dynamic and continuous business growth. Bill's typical client, he sees their company rising to a position of preeminence, and his clients aren't satisfied with just getting to the next level. They want so much more.
You are listening to Wealthy Advisor Mindset Podcast, a show dedicated to helping financial advisors grow their AUM while enjoying a great quality of life by creating a high-performance mindset. Guiding you on this podcast is none other than Nina Cook, a seasoned mindset coach who has worked with hundreds of business owners over the last decade to dissolve all their self-sabotaging behaviors and habits to achieve their business goals so they can have a much bigger impact and make much more money. Throughout the show, we'll deliver actionable strategies to grow your practice more easily and quickly, while revealing the incredible possibilities that emerge when you tap into your best self. Ready for a breakthrough that amplifies your impact and profits? Let's dive in.
Bill, we're going to explore the mindset and create that line between mindset and profitability and how having the right mindset is crucial to grow your business. And as I keep saying, I think this is an area that's really overlooked and it deserves a lot more attention than it's currently getting, which is why I created this podcast. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about your journey to having all the success that you have.
Okay, great. I'm looking forward to it, Nina.
So how did you get to this position? And can you just share some of the highlights in your transformation from, doing what you started out doing, all the transitioning, the pivots, the key pivots to get you to where you are now?
Okay. So I started, like many people, with a corporate job, and in my case, being in Seattle, Washington. One of the plum jobs to get was with IBM. So I joined IBM as a systems engineer, got on a fast track, got promoted several times, and ultimately discovered that I really wasn't cut out for working in a large environment at all. And so early on, after 8 years with IBM, I jumped into the entrepreneurial area initially, and for many, almost 3 decades, I spent my time in the investment arena. So initially, we were in the oil and gas space as money raisers. So we raised money for small independent oil and gas companies to drill and develop oil and gas wells all over the middle of the United States, really. And that went on for 8 years. And the oil and gas industry in the U.S. was then, and still is to some extent, tax enhanced. And by that I mean the economics are enhanced by U.S. tax policy, in theory making it easier. All it really does, in fact, is make the prices higher. But nonetheless, I decided to get involved in, stay in investments, but get involved in raising capital for other kinds of projects, non-oil and gas. But I was still with small business owners. By small, I mean revenues in the $5 to $500 million space. So not teeny, but small. And what happens when you're in that size of a company, you're not very attractive to the large investment banking firms on Wall Street. The deals are just too little, and they're not going to spend their time with you. But for me and my people, it was a beautiful space. And so time went on, though, and this is kind of so far, no real major transitions other than getting into entrepreneurial space. So what I discovered is being in the deal business meant I would feast the famine. So we would organize a deal, raise the capital, get paid. Now we have to do it again. And so that's what I mean by feast to famine, deal to deal, or project to project, or client to client. It's all feast to famine, if you will. I didn't like it, finally, and after 16 years, didn't like it, and decided that I wanted to sell my business. What I discovered is I was trapped in mediocrity. And you and I have talked about this before, about all industries have, if you will, a variance between the hopefuls, the mediocre, and the super successful. And each of those have different gradients. Those people, all industries, including my own investment banking, everybody doesn't think alike. They approach business entirely differently. Here I was with what I thought was decently successful. I made personally good money, and I had many employees that made extremely good income personally. But I wasn't happy and satisfied. I was anxious to sell my business. Nobody wanted to buy it. Why? There was nothing special about my business. I ended up talking with a competitor at some sort of a conference, and she said to me, well, your problem, Bill, is that you're emulating all the wrong people. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, there's this thing called industry best practices. And that still exists today. There are if you will, the best practices. But the truth of the matter is, they're the practices by the average. So industry averages have that label for a reason. They're the average of the industry. And so those are where the best practices are. And people look at those things and they try to be better than average. And that's what I was doing. So that's kind of the first touch I want to make on mindset. Is I think most people in most industries, whatever it may be, tend to identify with the majority of the industry. So we'll talk a bit more about 80-20, but I'm going to finish up this journey of mine and then hand the ball back to you. So I had this woman tell me that I was mediocre and I needed to change and emulate people like her, who were the top, in her case, the top 5% of the industry. Now, by that, I don't mean the top 5 revenue. She was really the top 5 from a prestige standpoint. She's very well known, ran a fantastic bank, and was somebody to be emulated. So I said, well, what do you do differently? She said, everything. I do everything differently. I don't do anything like anybody else does in our industry. I set about, this was in the late 1990s, repositioning my company to move it from mediocre to elite. And I found that all the, let's call it vendors or suppliers to every industry, they make money by selling to the average company. Why? Well, because there aren't very many companies at the top. So if you focus on servicing the top only, your market is small. It's a small number of people. In my case, I went to the business schools in the United States, the elite business schools, and the deans. I knew several of them. They said, hey, look, Bill, we are turning out MBAs, Masters of Business Administration, which become fine employees for people, but we don't turn out business owners like you. No, that's not our business. So then I visited with the big consulting firms, and everybody knows they're all over the planet. They still exist today. They're trying to make major sales, producing business plans and marketing plans and building software so they can employ all of their employees to do that. No help for me there. And finally, I talked to the business book writers, and they all basically got all their information from publicly traded companies that are kind of in the minimal area. So I ended up inventing my own systems. You've mentioned them already. One is business mastery. That's a system. And scaleology is another system. But the net of it was, summarizing all of that, I discovered that I needed to emulate people at the top of their industries copy their mindset, think like they do, and not think like the rest of the industry.
Wonderful. I love it. There's so much there to dive into. You said copy or emulate the people at the top of the industry and copy their mindset. How did you go about turning your thinking around, which had been pointing and sort of settled in mediocrity, to start thinking about and pointing it towards being elite? Because that is a change of thinking. And thinking is such an interesting thing because we think all the time, but most of the time we're thinking the same old thoughts from old conditioning, being raised in a certain family environment, school, blah, blah, blah. And that conditioning, that thinking sets up certain expectations that we put up for ourselves in life. I can only earn so much. I can only have this size of house, etc. So to turn your thinking from it pointing in one direction in your life up to that point to say, oh, now I'm going to start focusing here instead. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a big change. So how did you do that? How did you approach that change?
So that is an excellent question, and it gets to the core of my fundamental philosophies. And so when you use the word focus, so the key is where your mind is focused. I graduated in finance, specifically economics. That's my college degree. And it's the same as every other industry, and that is the industry is the average. And so out of that came the 80-20 rule. A lot of people call that Pareto principle, 80-20 rule. And it's interesting about what I'll call container words. Our listeners right now hear 80-20 and they say in their minds, I know all about that. And they don't. But what happens is that people hear a concept and they say, I know about that. So what the 80-20 principle is all about is that 20% of the inputs produce 80% of the outputs. So 20% of the consultants produced 80% of the revenue. 80% of the dentists produce 80% of the successful, if you will, procedures. True. 80% of the
or 20%, 20% of the, yeah.
20%, 80%. Yeah, it's always the same. So what I found out about that is that's well enough, but I needed to be more focused. So almost all of our industries are very large. So 20% is a huge number. 20% of the dentists in, let's say, just London, 20% of the dentists, it's a huge number of people. And so I needed to get that chunked or drilled down, get in smaller pieces. So I said to myself, oh, well, how about 20% of the 20%? Now that's a smaller number. 20% of the 20% of the dentists in London is only 4%. Now we got a nice little number. So let's look at the 4% of the dentists who are producing 80% of the 80%. That's 64%. 80% of 80% is 64. So 4% of the dentists are producing 64% of the revenue. Excellent. Now let's go find those people. And then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, Bill. That's still a big number. So how about taking it to what I call the third power? So one of my core philosophies is Pareto to the third power. So if you take 20% of 4%, that's 0.8. Let's round it up, 1%. So 20% of 4 is 1%, rounded up. So 1% of the dentists, in this example we're using, are producing 80% of 64. You do that math and it's 51. Make it 50. So 1% produce 50%. That is worth focusing on. So the first major philosophical thing that I changed in my mind back in the 1999 specifically was I needed to think like the 1%. The 1% produces half the revenue. The 1% produces half the profits. 1% in my business. I'm a consultant. I've been generating personally my little teeny firm $100,000 plus per month for years and years and years. Why? Because I'm in the top 1% of all the consultants. I'm not alone. Other people do that. But the vast majority of consultants, way south of $100,000 a year, let alone a month. So my first core change, Nina, was that I decided to go find and think about the 1%. And that's really also the way I run my own business. So what I do with my clients is I teach them and drill into them to stop thinking like their industry and start thinking like the 1% of their industry. Now, in every industry, that's a little teeny number. I've got all kinds of companies I deal, construction companies and printing company and distributors and manufacturers and solopreneurs and dentists and doctors, in fact. But I teach them to think exactly like the 1% do and don't get seduced by what I'll call container words. Now, both you and I are podcasters. You and I, neither of us want to be in the 1% of our podcast. We do it for different reasons. But there are podcasters, the 1%, who make very, very fine money. Very fine. So it's worth pursuing if you want to. I don't want to. I want to pursue consulting. But all industries are the same way. So the key, summarizing all of this up, Pareto to the third power, which means that 1% of your inputs produce 50% of your outputs, doing the math. So that's kind of a long answer to that quick little question. That's the core of my philosophy, my thinking, and that's what I help other people do.
Great. Love it. In terms of thinking about being at the top, at the elite in your industry, so you changed your thinking from, thinking like the masses to thinking like an elite. What were the main changes in your thinking? How did you create that change? So what was your old thinking about your business and profitability? And what was your new thinking? And how did you manage to make that stick?
So when I was, my old thinking hat was on, I felt successful being profitable, having good revenue, having good employees, being well regarded, basically being recognized as doing better than the industry averages. I felt accomplished. But then when I tried actually to convert that into a sale, then I realized that I had nothing, there was nothing special about me, what I was doing. So when you look at in my case, the investment bank, or in Europe, often called merchant bank, I should say, started saying, well, what is it about the people at the very top? Well, they do all those things, but what they do is they do things slightly different. Number one, they have extreme clarity on their vision. So the first thing I decided is I'm going to have absolute clarity about what I want to do down the road. I believe 5 to 10 years is a good place to have your vision. And the reason I have that in my mind is it's far enough away that nobody can, if you will, corner you on the facts. Because 5 years is enough time for new things to happen. And then 10 is kind of almost wonderland. So 5 years. So what I've discovered is when I tell somebody what I'm going to plan to do in 5 years, they tend to accept that as something I intend to do. They don't say, well, no, that sounds too ambitious. And everybody that can have a continual 5-year vision will not be criticized. They'll be instead admired because you're always envisioning something. And so tomorrow you add 1 day, and a week from now, it's a week So you keep that 5-year always in the future. You never want to let it arrive tomorrow, because then people can say, no, you didn't think right. But so a 5-year vision, always modified. Number 2 is to operate your enterprise with a management system. Now, most people have systems like for invoicing, or systems for running a, like you and me, running a podcast. We have ABC systems for podcasting. People have systems for maybe doing annual planning, or collecting what people owe them, for dealing with their vendors. Those are wonderful. Those are operating systems. But a management system is a way to hold your entire company accountable for what they agree to do. It's magical. First, the people that like to be held accountable are always the high performers. The low performers can't stand it because it shines a light on them. So once you start recruiting, telling people that you use an accountability culture, the high performers want to be there because they're used to performing at a high level. The business mastery system I talked about earlier, I developed that in the late 90s. I still use it today. I've installed it in hundreds and hundreds of different companies in all sorts of industries. At its core, it's a system of accountability, all the way down from the senior person to the newest hire. Fundamentally, keeping their agreements, or keeping their commitments, making commitments and keeping them. It's all what that's about. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to use my system. There are others, but unbelievably, there are very few, and most businesses don't have a system of management. They instead rely on what I'll call the industry momentum. In other words, you don't have to be too bright if you own a franchise to figure out what you should sell your hamburger for, because the franchise has already set those prices. You don't have to think about it. So most businesses get themselves involved in sort of the industry standards, I'll call them again, and therefore they don't operate with a management system. They don't have regular management meetings. They don't have a vision. They don't have a strategy. They don't have annual plans. They don't have monthly goals for all their people. They don't have people accountable. None of that stuff happens. Unbelievably, there's not a single top company that doesn't have a management system. They all do. That's why people look at a guy like, so for example, Elon Musk. How in the world does Elon Musk have all these business enterprises, and then he's out there as the hatchet man for the president of the United States? How? Because everything he's got is running on a system. You don't have to go to work every day. So that's number 2. Number 1's a vision. Number 2 is a management system. And then number 3 is leveraging a high performance team. How do you know if the team is high performance? Using a management system that holds people accountable, and the high performers will be hitting their goals all the time. So it's kind of a self-selection process. I'm not saying being casual about hiring people, but if you hire a high-quality person and they end up being accountable and they deliver the results, you'll have a high-performance team. And that's really it. So the change I made was from riding along with the industry norms and converting my company into a company with a long-term vision. In my case, sell my business. In 5 years, I did it in 2.5. Number 2, to convert my company from hiring good people and letting them do what they thought was the right thing to do, to holding everybody accountable and leveraging a high-performance team. In other words, I developed my team to the point where we were an enviable company. Everybody wanted to buy my business because my individual performers were so talented and demonstrated their results. So that's it. So philosophy, right up to the third power, top way to run your business, vision, management team, and high-powered team. Now, by the way, high-powered team includes suppliers, advisors, consultants, all the people that are not exactly your employees, but they're a part of your team. Like you and I are allies. And so we consider each other to be worth having as allies. We're not just casually being allies. Okay, that's the answer to how I changed my mind or my mindset.
Wonderful. I love that. And as you change your mindset, your self-image had to change. How you saw yourself, your self-concept. And we have two self-images. We have the outer self-image, which is how people see us physically, how we dress, how we look, how we move, we talk, etc. But there's the inner self-image, how we see ourselves, what we say to ourselves, how we talk to ourselves, what we expect to get out of life. So your inner self-image had to change for you to start seeing yourself as being an elite performer rather than, running with the masses. Did you deliberately set out to change that? Because you had to become the person in your mind first who could make those changes in your business. Because when we try and change a habit, when we keep the same poor self-image, the habit falls away after a day or two. And we think, well, that didn't work. I'm not the sort of person who can change my habits. And we go back to our old comfort zone. But in order to make a new habit stick or a new behavior stick, we have to see ourselves differently first. Were you aware of doing that, or did it sort of creep up on? Did you make a deliberate decision around that?
I made a very specific decision. So first off, continuing on my theme, what we're talking about, if you do things the way other people do, that you can see, i.e. the people in your industry or niche, whatever you're going to call them, you can't do what they do. So number one, you cannot do anything those people do. So one of the things that most business owners do is they think they personally or should be something special. They have to be better than everybody else. They have to be essential. So the first mindset that I made in myself is I said, I have to get myself out of the way. I have to convert myself from essential to non-essential. It's a very difficult thing to do. But I discovered that I was my own worst enemy. Thinking that I was good and talented and smart and all that. And the truth was, I didn't have to do any of those things. So the first thing I made a decision that I cannot be essential. Now, it turns out my company wasn't named Bill Prater Investment Bank. Instead, it had another name, which means that I didn't have to be associated with it. And by the way, if you're going to sell your business, you better not be associated with it because you'll never sell it. They'll want to keep you. And so that was the first thing. So I discovered that really I needed to do three things, only three things. One was you're the only one that can do the vision. You can't delegate that. So the vision for your own enterprise has to be you. So number one, I knew that. Number two, I had to absolutely create a culture, the culture of the company. And I had to emulate the culture. For example, the culture I created for my business and the one that I teach my clients is a culture of accountability. So that's the core piece of the culture. Now there's other things, but that's the key. So I had to myself be allowed. I had to allow my team to hold me accountable. So in my management system that I decided to do is I didn't tell anybody to do anything. I purposely didn't do it. Instead, I would say, hey, here's our meeting. We got a month to cover. What's your commitments? And I would be one of the people in the room and make a commitment. So, for example, I might commit to close a deal with Pillsbury. People would say, hey, Bill, can't you get that Pillsbury deal closed this month? And I'd say, all right, I commit. I'll get a deal signed with Pillsbury. Now, what that meant by me saying that is I empowered the other people on my team to hold me accountable for that. So that was my commitment for the month. Then they took their turns. So that was the main major thing that I did. Then, though, Here's the thing. If things are just left alone, they start to decay and fall apart. It's called entropy. Things go from order to chaos. And so I realized that I did have to keep track. I had to pay attention. I had to watch. So I decided to have my management meetings, same time, same place, every single week. So on a weekly basis, I ran this meeting I'm describing to you. And I could use that touch, if you will, to see how things were going. And I created a bunch of tools, vital driver dashboard, goals scorecard, goals and controls. Well, these terms, these are my terms as part of my industry. But the net of it was the major mindset change that I had to make was going from essential to not valuable, literally, and just not be important. And that made a huge difference, freed me up. I didn't feel trapped. I was able to, if you will, take time off with my family, travel, watch my children grow up, all that stuff. And because I was not essential, I just one of the people. That makes sense?
Makes absolute sense. That's great. I love that. So what is the biggest lesson that life has taught you so far?
Biggest lesson, I think, for me is that everybody, every individual can exceed at a very, very high level if they're in the right spot. If somebody is mediocre at a certain sport, there's another sport where they'll be a lead at. Right now, in this world today, there are hundreds of athletic endeavors going on, I mean, all kinds of things. You know, who would have ever thought that one of my buddies who used to ride a skateboard would go on to form a company that built parks, if you will, for people to go do skateboarding on. He found his right spot. So I discovered within companies that, generally speaking, just because somebody can't perform at spot A, they can at spot B. That's my biggest lesson, is helping people find their right spot, including myself, and then giving them an environment so they can shine. Give them an environment so they're shine. Now, here's a curious kind of a circle back on that. In a typical company, there are people that have jobs that are kind of high profile. Let's call them, for example, the sales job, high profile. Then there are people who have a job that is kind of low profile, like accounts payable clerk. Accounts payable clerk don't get their names in lights because they don't come in with orders and stuff like that. But when you run one of these business mastery accountability sessions, the accounts payable person who made a commitment to save 5% from a vendor, and she says, yes, I was successful saving 5% from such and such a vendor who we buy $1 million worth a year. So 5% of $1 million, $50,000 is about 100% of her compensation, right? So what I discovered, my biggest lesson was put people in the right spot and they'll perform at a high level. So part of my job was figuring out where that spot was. Biggest lesson in life for me.
Yeah, everyone can thrive in the right spot. I like that. So, Bill, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together, although I could have talked for a lot longer. Absolutely fascinating. How can our listeners find out more about you and the wonderful work you're doing?
Well, the easiest way, and we're all kinds of resources, over the years, over 25 years doing what I'm doing, I've developed all kinds of resources. Many of them I used to sell, online training programs, things like that. I don't do much of that anymore, so most of it's free. They can just simply go to Business Mastery Pro. Business Mastery Pro is actually businessmastery.pro as opposed to .com, but businessmastery.pro.
Fantastic. And they can just help themselves to a wonderful array of tools and all sorts of guidance and advice to help them to become more profitable. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure hanging out with you. I've really, really enjoyed it. And for everyone who's joined us today, thank you so much for your company. Really enjoyed it. Till next time. Bye-bye for now.
I hope you enjoyed the episode today on the Wealthy Advisor Mindset. Make sure to hit subscribe on your chosen platform to get notifications on upcoming episodes. If this episode made you think of someone who you think would benefit from listening to it, then go ahead, take a screenshot, and share this episode with them, or post it on your social media to share with your friends and colleagues. You can catch the show notes for this episode and any mentioned links in the description. If you're a financial advisor who is struggling to grow your AUM and profits while creating a great work-life balance, and you know it's because your mindset is stopping you, or you have a specific challenge in mind that you would love Nina's feedback on, go to chatswithnina.org and grab a time that works best for you. We'd love to see if we can help you. Once again, it's chatswithnina.org. We will see you in the next episode.